So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to discuss with you. Last year already, we had a fantastic seminar thanks to Henrik and nice discussions. And it's a real pleasure to go on discussing or maybe having a conversation, as Saras would say, on design and entrepreneurship. A bit like Roberto and Mattia, I am not in entrepreneurship, but much more in design and more specifically in design theory. And what I would like to try to do today with you is to use design theory to understand what is specific to designing in entrepreneurship. That's a kind of selfish program. We can, as Roberto said, there is design in entrepreneurship, no doubt about this, and Henrik already underlined this. But the point from design theory is to wonder whether there is something very specific in designing in situation of entrepreneurship, and that's what I would like to discuss with you. And the surprise of this investigation is that finally, it's not really the question of being strongly creative or original that is specific to design and entrepreneurship, but finally, it's much more the intention of building something strong and transmittable, something that is not only an asset, but an asset that could even be useful for further creation. That's what we call a creation heritage. And the hypothesis is that in entrepreneurship as design, finally, the great challenge for design theorists is to understand what does it mean to design a creation heritage. Last year, I discussed with you some parallel between entrepreneurship as design and advances in design theory, and I wanted to go beyond this. I won't go again through this. And exactly the point was, is there something specific? Is there some specific type of design in entrepreneurship? Some element, I have only 3 points finally, some element on the method and the theoretical framework, and 2 moments then. The first one is to build this hypothesis. We might consider that entrepreneurship as design is the design of a creation heritage. And then we use design theory and see how design theory helps predict some kind of strange behavior of an entrepreneur who is designing this creation heritage. Regarding material, we didn't speak a lot on material, but what we did with my colleagues, Blanche Secrestin and Louise, is both to rely on existing so-called deep tech startups, successful deep tech startup, as Roberto already mentioned. I won't go too deep in this. This is still ongoing work. And the second source of empirical material is more history. Of course, there are a lot of problems with using historical sources, but at least it helps to have some kind of illustration among the successful entrepreneurs of the past. There is Wedgwood, and Wedgwood, I just showed you one of his realization. The point is that with Wedgwood, we have both something that is fantastically creative and at the same time, something that is now part of our heritage. And regarding another point on the method, not the empirical material, but the theoretical framework, we use some of the available design theories. And here, building on what has already been said, we will use the most advanced theories. Simon is one provider of theory. We discussed that last year. It's more in the line of the decisional school, operation research, programming. And here we have the logic of modeling choice and reasoning in complex situations. And there is another school that you might know, which is a German one. Some of you here know this. And here this is different. You have a fixed language of the object, but you are able to design something that was not here at the beginning. Whereas with Simon, we tend to rather have a search process to find something that corresponds to a given optimum. In the case of the classical German engineering, you find in the end an object that is strictly different from all the previous one. So there was 2 traditions that had in the past very few conversations, but in the last 2 decades, these 2 traditions have merged and discussed a lot and converge toward a contemporary design theory. To make things extremely quick, we could consider that contemporary design theory, on the one hand, identify the idea that there is knowledge. We know things on the problems. We know things on the solutions. We know things on values. We know things on what is surgery. We know things on what is curing, etc., etc. And in this field, we can try to find an optimum. Or we can say this word is not the only one we want to have. We want to have word making, as you mentioned, Saras. And here we go in the unknown. We would like to cure differently. We have to rediscuss what is a human being. And we have to explore the unknown. And design is also this movement, not only to optimize with the given building blocks, but also to create a better future, to have the will to explore the unknown for creating new values, new ways of living together, etc., etc. And we, in design theory, we separate these two moments, the place where we are only in optimization and the moment where we are more in the exploration mode. We are more in the unknown, and this exploration mode can finally be conducted can be led in a quite rigorous way. This is what we learned from contemporary design theories. Now, if we use this framework on entrepreneurship, the funny game is to say, well, where is knowledge in entrepreneurship? Well, there is for any entrepreneur, and the one I mentioned before, Wedgwood, Eiffel, Watson Boulton, whatever, what you see is that they know a lot of things. And even more than that, they know immediately that they will have to know on what are the value of the users, what are the existing markets, who are the competitors. So finally, the point for them is to have an extremely balanced work on what is known and what is possible to explore. So they know a lot and they will learn a lot and they will finally build a lot on the things that are already existing. On the other hand, so finally, the point for an entrepreneur from the knowledge side is to learn and finally to adapt also a lot, to have the chance to make business in the end. Second, what is the unknown? Well, fantastic unknown, as you mentioned, Saras, an hour before. The entrepreneur is looking for changing the world. So the point is with high ambition. But on the other hand, this ambition is also to make real business, to meet the expectation of a lot of our customers, to finally address a lot of people. And again, we see here a tension between the fact that you will explore, but you want to make it real. It's not just abstract discussion. We want to have in the end product, services, changes in the society. So the surprise that if you look at this, there is both innovation and the logic of being real and preserve what exists, preserve the value of users, preserve the value of customers, of value chains, etc., etc. So the surprise for designers is that in entrepreneurship, there is a logic of innovation combined with a logic of preservation. And I do the same exercise as Roberto and look at what it means to teach design in the different areas in design schools or in engineering design or in entrepreneurship. And just taking some quotation, what is funny is that when we speak of creativity in an industrial design school, the point is, I went to Bauhaus, maybe one of the seminal industrial design school, and the motto is, we want to help students expand their creative gift. So there is even a kind of logic of creativity for the sake of creativity. Of course, this is not exactly the same thing in entrepreneurship. And here I quote you, Saras, we learn to use a given set of means to change the world, but a given set of means, and we want to change the world. We don't only want to be original. The same is true for engineering. We would find the same point. So the surprising thing is that finally, there is something very specific in entrepreneurship as design, seen from design theory, of course. It's not this kind of design we could have in bricolage, tips and tricks. We want to change the world. It's not pure utopic exploration. We want to make it true, to realize it. It's not incremental development. It's not only that we optimize existing products, we want to go beyond this. And it's not moon landing because we have limited resources. We have to do this in a limited time. So again, when we look at this, there is something specific, this combination of innovation and preservation, constraints following the constraints of the real world. There is another part. If you look at the ambition, it's not only that you want to do this once. If you look at the results of the entrepreneur, it's not only that he has a product, but what he makes, this is a company, this is an enterprise. And finally, the point that you want to make it enduring. You create a process where other people will jump in. So you want that not only you create once, but you want to create a movement where creation will be repeatable. And again, this is quite interesting. What entrepreneurs are designing, innovation, plus preservation, plus heritage, and a heritage on which people will be able to create. It's not only that they will protect it, but they will preserve and create. So again, this combination between creation and preservation. So if we accept this hypothesis, this is of course quite strange, because we tend to consider that there is an opposition. This is either innovation or tradition. And finally, in this opposition, we tend to think that this is a kind of trade-off. Either you renounce on preserving, you change everything, or you renounce on innovating and you keep tradition. And finally, what is funny is that in design theory, we learn that this is logically not true. You can, and you can find situations where people innovate while by preserving. And this is what is interesting. What is this logic of innovation where you not only preserve while reducing innovation, but you preserve while increasing innovation? It would take too much time to go in the details of this learning, but just to give you one example that is not in, or maybe not in entrepreneurship, we could call it entrepreneurship, but never mind. If you think about the French grande cuisine, you have design, you have tradition, you have innovation, you have tradition. Design theory helps to understand what it means to be an innovative, great chef. And the process is more or less as follows. Suppose you want to make a dish with meat and sauce, and this is the rules that you are supposed to preserve. Of course, it's very simplistic. And you want now to make a traditional vegetarian dish. Of course, you understand the point. You might immediately say, you know, the rule is that a dish has meat and sauce. And if there is no meat, it's not a dish, and you forget about this. So tradition kills innovation. Or you say, no, we should change tradition. Saying that a dish is always with meat, it's a past. We change this and we have a new tradition. A dish is made only with sauce, and that's far enough. The funny thing is that you can explain with design theory that there are other routes. And you can explain all the creation of great chefs to reinvent what is a meat without meats. To reinvent the classics, but to do this with all the other meanings of meat. Is this protein, or is this shape, or is this color, or is this just a tradition? And here you see this is, for instance, how Ducasse revisited a burger without meat. So you have everything, the shape is here, the taste is here, but not the meat. And you see how you can combine tradition and innovation. The conditions to do this can be studied with design theory. And I go to some property of the study. The first point is that if you want to innovate and preserve, you have to be quite clear on what you want to preserve. So property one, the entrepreneur should, this is an hypothesis or maybe a proposition, the entrepreneur should be very, very careful on what he wants to preserve. And of course, we tend to read in books that entrepreneurs are changing everything, but we also learn that they don't change everything. They purposefully, intentionally keep a lot of things also. That's one of the funny parts of the history. You discover, for instance, that Edison, of course, is seen. We all have read Hughes, for instance. We know that Edison is seen as having created a full system. This is true, but a large part of the system is a direct copy of the gas lighting. Business model is exactly the same. Even the pipes are the same. So of course, this is a system creation, but based on a lot of building blocks. There is an intention to preserve, and you have to be clear on what is this preservation strategy. Is it initially sought out, or do you design what has to be preserved? That should be investigated. We find cases where the entrepreneur knows that from the beginning. We also see cases where the entrepreneur, step by step and painfully, learned on what has to be preserved. So the preservation process is also part of the entrepreneurship process. Property one. Property 2, and this comes back to a discussion, probably you don't remember, Saras, but it's a discussion we had last year on the question of what is is knowledge modular or not for the entrepreneur? What we learn here is that what happens during the entrepreneurship process is that a successful entrepreneur, when he designs, will finally design the modularity. Just in the case of Tempus Aura, what is interesting is not that the watchmaker is using modular knowledge. The point is who designed the modularity. And what he discovered is that successful entrepreneur, in that particular case, again, he transforms a complex, non-modular set of knowledge, scattered, complex, etc., spaghettis, and he transforms it in something that has an architecture, platform, modules, etc. And you find this in well-known history. Wedgwood, again, a fantastic work of Wedgwood was to wonder and to ask designers, industrial designers at the time, what could be the shape that is as simple as possible, but could carry out as many decors, as many paintings, varied painting as possible. So reorganize knowledge so that it becomes modular. And of course, it means that in the entrepreneurship process, you will finally reorganize your engineering department. You will create the research and development, etc., etc. Property 3.
Pascal, I'm sure you're about to finish up now, but I just want to remind you of time.
So, maybe I just, it would take too much time. Sorry, excuse me, Henrik. With timing, I try to keep time for discussion. I just have this list of property. Property 3 is quite funny. This is the moment where you have to reinterpret some rules. Look at the case of the great chef. He reinterprets what is meat. This is the same for the entrepreneur. He will create, or not create, but recreate, extend some rules. This can be norms, standards, technologies, uses. But there is a moment where, yes, here is going to innovate. And here you can do this quite locally or with a great ambition, meaning that the new extended rule is valid only locally for a very limited time, or is valid for the whole world or for a long time period on several culture, whatever. Fourth property, interesting. And what is the entrepreneurship strategy in this? You finally try to tune the level of re-extension. And we find the language of entrepreneurs is capacity to finally accept some rediscussion and refuse some rediscussion of the rules. And finally, a technical important consequence of this, we discovered that this regime of innovation while preservation finally is not closed. So you can even almost constantly recreate this movement of innovation and recreation. So these are quite interesting properties that we deduce from design theory and that could help to investigate some particular form of design in the in entrepreneurship situations. With this, I think I can stop here.
Okay, thank you, Pascal. This was a mouthful, as always. Let's see. Before I just open up on some of the questions in the chat here. When you talk about the creation heritage, I'm trying to grasp what you mean by that. Do you mean like the actual kind of artifact, to use Simon's terms, that is being designed continuously, or is it just kind of some sort of set of knowledge, some sort of concept, or is it something that you design that others then take as tradition and build further on? Or can you just clarify what you mean by that concept?
Maybe the best example is the case of cooking. You see that in cooking, you take a big book written by the great chefs. You have the heritage of what is cuisine at a certain moment of time. And build on this, it is not a list of recipes, but a great chef will read all the ancient chefs and recreate a new recipes on this. It doesn't break the rules, it just extends the rules. So a creation heritage is somewhere where you have the rules, and inside the rules, you also have the capacity to extend them. So this is not only that you have a fixed set of rules and you break or keep them. No, you have a fixed set of rules which contain the capacity to innovate. Think about a firm. It's not only a set of rules, it's also a capacity to innovate based on these rules. This is why it's a heritage for creation.
Right, but it's not the concrete thing being designed, it's more the tradition in which you operate, which is kind of partly needs, it goes back to this notion of optimal distinctiveness that we talked about a little bit before, that you exist and operate within a tradition and you need to relate to that in a way that builds, you know, cognitive legitimacy and other kinds of legitimacy, but you can stretch it in certain ways, but not too many. That's kind of the tradition you're in. Yeah. Okay, let's see here. I think Nadav had a pretty poignant question here. If you're with us now, Nadav.
Thank you, Henrik. It was more a point of reflection. I think one way to move away from this dichotomy between creation and discovery and trying to understand the interface between the concepts of design and entrepreneurship is not to speak these languages. And if we do speak these languages, then understand the kind of basic assumptions that are going on in the background. I think that both approaches built on metaphysical breach on our understanding of man and its relationships to the overall environment. So for me, entrepreneurship and design should be first and foremost understood from the point of view of ethics. And I believe that even Herbert Simons, with his most, where in the previous presentation was presented as, taking a more technical side, the point of it, there was actually ethical. Entrepreneurship is a self-organizing endeavor precisely and deviates from other forms of employment precisely because individuals experience a positive freedom, not freedom from, but the freedom to design their own approach to the world. That doesn't mean that they create value or create meaning. It doesn't mean that we can understand them as on ways of procedural rationality as atomists, like in the positivistic tradition, as calculative machines. It means that we need to dig deeper into the sources of our identity, understanding how entrepreneurship can contribute to the world in terms of how can I align my moral vision with the actions I take in the material world of the market. In that sense, to me, it's much more interesting to listen to how entrepreneurship can inform design rather than how design and design practices can inform entrepreneurship. I hope it's clear.
You want to react to that, Pascal?
Yes, of course. This dialogue is this is exactly this movement that we try to do. Since I am in design, the point is exactly for me, what do we learn in the design community from the entrepreneurship knowledge, you see? And exactly what, honestly, from a design perspective, what we learn from entrepreneurship is that there is a very strange combination between preservation and breakthrough. And this is not what we see in all design traditions. There are other design traditions that won't play this game with this extreme balance. This is exactly the exercise that we did, following what you said. Conversely, the point is, when we have two fields meeting like this, entrepreneurship and design, what is interesting for entrepreneurship is, are there some techniques, some tools, some lenses that help to see something new in entrepreneurship? Do we discover in this meeting, in this conversation, do we discover something that was less easy to see without conversation? But it's, I would say this is a program. This is probably the program Entrepreneurship as Design. It's exactly to understand what is co-created in this process.
Thank you, Pascal. I guess my point is more political. I would really like to influence you researchers, okay, to start research on ethical questions. But because if we take the language of entrepreneurial opportunities from the perspective, let's say, of Shane and Venkat and most research on entrepreneurship, which take this model as the background picture, then in my opinion, we reinforce a false picture of humanity and of human beings. On the other hand, if we take the postmodern existential entrepreneurs can, some kind of romantic postmodern heroes that they can create some kind of value out of nothing, it's also, in my opinion, very problematic. We need to understand individuals in the context of relationships, ongoing relationships, and I believe design can contribute quite a lot to this. Yeah.
Yes, but yeah, sorry, please, Henrik.
Oh, sorry. No, no. I think you said ethics there, and my take on various kinds of theories is that different theories have different virtues, right? They have different things that they're good at. There are different things that different theories aim to accomplish. So if you take Shane and Venkat or others who adopt concepts from economics to describe entrepreneurship as a kind of matching of individual and environmental circumstances, that has certain virtues. It's very simple. You can discuss it in terms that have a theoretical tradition in economics that you can borrow from, etc. Not very strong on ethics. But on the other hand, one of the strengths, I think, and this is something that I think Simon was debating with a few others, is whether or not design is inherently ethical. And I would say that it is, right? Because design, by definition, is the creation of some sort of artifact in light of a human being or multiple human beings' intentions and purposes. So you can take, to use my original presentation, you can take the descriptive natural science of nuclear physics, and you can use that to create a fission bomb, or you could build nuclear power plants with it, right? That's very ethical questions. What do you want to do? What is the purpose? What is the consequence of it? And I think that is just one of the advantages of this kind of design perspective, is that you have to grapple with those issues. You cannot just propose theories and procedures without reflecting on those kind of ethical questions. Now, someone like Simon might say that, well, you can be value neutral as a design theorist. You can develop procedures for optimization that can be used for both good and bad, for instance. But I think it brings us closer to these ethical questions that I think is something that we need to do.
Just a small comment on this, because this is, of course, as researcher in design, this question is, of course, something where we discuss regularly. And again, what could be funny is to wonder what is the ethics of the designer, not as an external thing, but what does it mean to ethically design? And you discover that there is a kind of, for instance, as a designer, if you say there is only one solution to this problem, you are not rigorous. And the ethics of designer is often to say, no, there are necessarily several solutions. Or another kind of ethics of design, you probably know the terrible experiments done on the so-called sacrificial dilemma. And you said to people, do you prefer to kill these people or these people, whatever? The ethics of design is say, okay, can we design a solution to avoid to have to choose, to avoid to decide and to explore alternatives? So there is probably an ethics of design that is not exactly orthogonal to design, but is deeply linked to design. Again, the question is, does the design way of thinking change and bring something to ethics? Research question.
I think Thomas has been raising his hand for a while. Did you have a comment?
Not for a while, but an immediate reaction.
Oh,
I think that to some extent, I believe we are sometimes too narrowly focusing on design as an exercise of creating some type of product or service, and forgetting about all the things that others call peripheral aspects of a new venture idea. And I think that those peripheral aspects is actually what Pascal mentioned in how did you call it, the heritage, creating a heritage, so that something is continuously reenacted and redesigned and, well, we might call it bought or whatever, right? It reappears. It's not about only designing one particular house or something in a location X, but to create something bigger, to disclose new worlds maybe. And I think what Nadav was, as far as I understood you at least, your comments about ethics was also to some large extent about how do we bring about the solutions and who do these solutions affect, and are the problems that we are addressing the problems that are relevant for most parts or the people, the stakeholders that we have to involve in the process. And I think there, the idea of how can we create and make entrepreneurship a more relational process. And I think that Raghu Garud can also say much about this from a performativity perspective. This is where it becomes important, because we need to include more diverse opinions. We need to become more brave and more creative, not only about what do we create, but how do we bring it about and how are people involved in it. So, yeah.
Oh, I think that's very true. I mean, there is an interesting paper to be written about entrepreneurial spillovers by someone, I guess. I think first Raghu and then Saras raised their hands. So Raghu, please.
Yeah, there's been a lot of interesting conversations out here. I will keep myself brief. First, what Pascal proposed of preserving and innovating draws my attention again to the notion of time and temporality, which I think has been kind of the elephant in the room, but not been theorized adequately. It's coming into the literature, I believe, in entrepreneurship, but there's a lot of resources coming from the process research and organizing studies, which I would encourage people to do in terms of how the past, present, and future shape these kind of initiatives. The second comment I want to make is about what Thomas just now said. From a performative point of view, it is not an individual who is deciding what is ethical or not. The problem is that there are multiple actors involved from their own context, and they all come with different value propositions. And it is the challenge of which of those value propositions are going to succeed. Complicating matters are wicked problems, which was mentioned before. So you try to address one person's problem, you create someone else's problem, right? So I just wanted to say that it is not an individual. Actually, you have to create, again, borrowing from Michel Kellon's work, Pascal, which you brought in Hachual. I happened to visit École des Mines, in which I happened to, I met him, and then
I was there.
CK.
I remember.
But if you look at the Kellon's approach, the hybrid forums, in which the issue is to how do you have people come and discuss and debate their values. And it is in that process the values get implicated in the artifacts which are emerging and the stories which are told. Enough of my inputs. Thanks.
Saras, you want to jump in?
I just wanted to, Raghu said a lot, so I'm just trying to get my thread again. I just wanted to kind of talk about what Nadav and Thomas had said, and then hopefully it links to what Raghu is saying, which is really sometimes we do not look at what we are not doing, right? What I mean by that is not in a research perspective, but from something like a stakeholder theory perspective, right? We never ask ourselves who is not at the table. So for example, when we look at Shane and Venkatraman and we define entrepreneurship as a pursuit of opportunities, we never ask the question, maybe it should be the pursuit of not having opportunities, right? Which is the problem for billions of people around the world, that they literally do not have any opportunities. So I think the idea of bringing into ethics could be a way for us to start thinking about reformulating problems in terms of things that we do not see normally, or we do not talk about. We don't think about who is not at the table in some ways. So I just thought that is what Nada was sort of heading towards, right? That we go on this conversational rabbit hole, and all of a sudden it's like we understand everything about opportunity, or how to study it, or about design and how to use it, and then we forget what we are not talking about. So that's what I was thinking Nada was headed towards.
Thank you very much, Saras,
yeah.
for clarifying this. I would even clarify, after you and say the problem is so big because it's not just a matter of it's not just an epistemological problem. The problem is that we are becoming wired to reality through the models we hold in mind. So, we hold in mind a certain understanding of entrepreneurship, and then we become wired as researchers and educators to see this phenomena from that perspective. And the bridge is just going and widening between what it's actually meant to do an entrepreneurship and be an entrepreneur, and how we kind of see that, and research on that. So, so I think that the idea here is to try to close this gap and try to better make sense of what entrepreneurship is all about. And then ethics is inevitable because consciousness itself is best in values. It's an illusion to believe that we can somehow separate a descriptive component from an evaluative one.
So you like Hillary Putnam, huh? Fact value dichotomy? No.
I'm not too much influenced by this work.
Okay, all right. You should tell me what you are influenced by. I would find it interesting. Maybe put it in the chat box or on Henrik's email later. Would definitely like to continue the conversation.
Look, guys,
we do forget that sometimes in entrepreneurship.
I think that what I draw attention to a more critical perspective. I try to move away from either a very dogmatic or skeptical, and we have very different narratives here. We have the naturalistic narrative in entrepreneurship. We find more and more a postmodern narrative in entrepreneurship, but a truly critical position, somewhat between Hegel and Kant, with an Aristotelian framework at the background, is missing. And trust me, Saras, I have tried to publish papers on that, from Business Venturing Insights, the smallest journals to the biggest journals, and it's very, very difficult. Again, precisely because it is a political move. It is difficult.
I think that's a different conversation. The whole publishing and politics and publishing, that's a different conversation. I would say we don't go there here. Let's stick to the more substantive point which you made, which is that we have to, ethics has to be more front and center. What is worth designing, or what is worth designing that we are not thinking about? I mean, so I'm with you on most things, but unless Henrik wants to go there, I would rather not get into the publication conversation.
We have 5 or 6 minutes before we need to wrap this up, but I mean, in general, I think trying to kind of ground an ethical position in I guess when you say Aristotle, I'm sure you're talking about this type of the virtues, and his virtue theories, and the phronesis as a kind of mode of engaged virtuous behavior and things like that. But I mean, if one wants to publish that type of thing, it's really important to be super clear in one's arguments, and I've reviewed, I'm sure, I don't think I've reviewed anything that you have written, I'm sure, but sometimes you get more speculative, ungrounded papers that try to accomplish this type of thing. And I think it's important to not just follow one's passions and promote an idea, but try to truly ground it and make a reasoned case.
And actually engage in the conversation, right? So I find sometimes people come from philosophy or come from ethics, and myself, I'm like a joint professor of ethics. So one of the things they don't bother to actually understand what entrepreneurship researchers are talking about and doing. They don't read the literature. And so that's the publication issue, right? And that can come from design. If we suddenly decide to publish in some other field, that problem is a different problem than whether we are open to the centrality of it.
But I think,
for example, Violina Rindova's paper on entrepreneurship as emancipation, right?
I didn't want to divert the discussion towards publication.
No. But this is interesting because I think, and I'll let Dimo in and have the last word here. You've been having your hand raised for a while, but I think precisely what we're talking about now, how design is wrapped up with values and ethics, and how design involves issues of meaning. I mean, Roberto's old work on designing meaning of both in products and in other contexts, that to make sense of that type of thing, it's important to reflect on what it is to be a human being, and how one relates to the world, and what meaningful behavior is, and all that type of stuff. So I think there is great, I mean, to the extent that this whole design approach to entrepreneurship takes hold, I think that is a discussion that needs to be had, that type of kind of philosophical grounding. And I think Saras, you spoke a bit about it. Raghu was clearly, latching on to those types of discussions, and so there's absolutely room for that type of publication. I think it's even very important, I would say. Now we have a few minutes left, and Dimo, I need to give you the word.
Thank you, Henrik. I'll try to be very very quick. I think this is a very, very interesting, raises a question about the nature of entrepreneurship as a discipline in its space within the broader academia. So I'll just draw a quick parallel with the German football team from a few years back when they won the World Cup, and Thomas Müller, one of the players, had this very interesting position called Raumdeuter, or space explorers. He was the person on the team without any defined role. His role within a match was to look for space and look for things, and he wasn't constrained by any tactical or strategic. And so within academia, if you think about disciplines, they're constrained by, in terms of defining their boundaries. And there's a case to be made, and that links to Pascal's idea of this innovation and preservation, is that entrepreneurship becomes like a cloud, free to explore the different spaces and chooses what to preserve and where to innovate, but never being tied up in one place. So it's free to wander around. How do you actually institute within the structure of a university and academia is very interesting, but that's something that I'd like to leave us with as a thought.
Yeah. We should wrap this up now. I need to go up and do some other things in 2 minutes, so I cannot stay around. I could leave the Zoom room open if someone wants to continue these discussions, but I think we'll meet back tomorrow again, and I'm sure many of the thoughts that we got and many of the comments that we thought were relevant for the presentations today will find room tomorrow as well. So I just want to thank everyone for today. And I'll see you tomorrow, and try to be here sharp so we don't lose any time. So thanks again for a fantastic seminar.
Yeah, thanks, Henrik.
Thank you so much, Henrik.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Henrik.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.